We just want to know what happened and why our baby didn't come home.
18-year-old Nolan Xavier Wells went to Horn Island with his friends for the 4th of July. His friends came back. Nolan didn't. The explanation was simple. Nolan chose to stay behind with a young woman and planned to find another ride home. But his parents don't believe that, because the son they raised had been taught one rule his entire life. If you leave with a group, you come back with the group.
I don't know why he would. We always taught him to, if you go with a group, you stay with a group. Even when he was in college, he would say, "Dad, well, we're gonna ride down to a party or something in another city." Now, so I always tell him, look, if you go with 5, you come back with 5. Do not separate from your group. Because I always say safety is in numbers. And he always said, yes, sir. So he knew to stay with his group. So why would he split from his group? I don't know.
So that would have been unusual for him to split from the group.
Then there was Nolan's phone, a phone he was constantly using, taking pictures, recording videos, posting on Snapchat. But when the phone was returned to his family, his mother says something was wrong. The photos and Snapchat activity she expected to find were gone.
And you say you have Nolan's cell phone and messages were deleted. How could you tell messages were deleted?
Well, his parents got the phone back, and that's something that's important, Michael, because they tracked this phone on Life 360.
And the questions didn't stop there. A video appears to capture an argument involving Nolan's phone. One account says Nolan wanted to stay on the island. Another says he planned to return to the boat. Even the description of what Nolan was wearing reportedly conflicted with photographs taken that day. Investigators say they have found no evidence of a crime. But Nolan's parents are asking one question. If the story is that simple, why doesn't it add up? This is the case of Nolan Xavier Wells. Before we continue, subscribe to Midnight Crime Files, because this case is far from over. Before examining the timeline, the phone, or the contradictions now surrounding this case, it is important to understand who Nolan Xavier Wells was, because his parents' questions are deeply connected to the young man they say they knew. Nolan was 18 years old. He was a college student and athlete attending Southwest Mississippi Community College. Football was a major part of his life, but according to his father, Nolan's character wasn't defined by how loudly he spoke or how much attention he demanded. Elmore described his son as a silent leader, the type of person others watched. On the football field and basketball court, Elmore said people followed Nolan's actions rather than his words. He was respected. He made friends easily. According to his father, people naturally gravitated toward him. And Nolan had plans. He was preparing to return to school and get ready for the upcoming football season. According to accounts discussed by his family, Nolan reportedly had a Division I tryout scheduled for the Monday following the 4th of July weekend. That detail has become important to Elmore, not because having a football tryout proves what happened on Horn Island. It doesn't. But to Nolan's father, it provides context about where his son's mind was at that point in his life. Nolan had somewhere to be. He was building towards something. Football, school, his future. Elmore has said Nolan was preparing to get back to business, and that is one reason he struggles with the idea that his son suddenly abandoned the people he arrived with to remain on an island without his phone. Nolan's parents also say there was one lesson they repeatedly taught him: stay with your group. Elmore said he warned Nolan about separating from friends. He even specifically remembered talking to his son about not leaving his group simply to chase after a girl. The message was direct. There would be other girls. Stay with the people you came with. For Elmore, these weren't conversations he had once or twice. He says he repeated them again and again. He even believed Nolan probably became tired of hearing the same advice. Elmore told his son that one day, Nolan would understand why his father had been so persistent. That one day he might call him and admit his father had been right. Those conversations now sit at the center of Elmore's disbelief, because the explanation the family says they received requires them to accept that Nolan did almost exactly what his father had spent years warning him not to do: separate from the group, stay behind, and according to the family's concerns, do it without his phone. Elmore acknowledges something important. Parents can believe the best about their children, A parent may struggle to imagine their child making a reckless decision. But Elmore's position is not that Nolan was incapable of making mistakes. His argument is that this specific decision was so directly opposed to what they had repeatedly discussed that he needs more than a simple explanation. He wants to understand exactly how Nolan ended up alone. Christine feels the same way. She has described her son as someone who was frequently active on Snapchat. He would take pictures, record videos, send his mother a quick selfie, ask her to smile, tell her to make a peace sign. His phone was part of his normal daily life. That detail would become extremely important later. But on the morning of July 4th, none of those concerns existed. To Nolan's parents, their son was simply going out with friends. It was a trip this group had reportedly made before. There was no obvious warning that this 4th of July would end with a missing person investigation, and eventually, with Nolan's body being recovered from the water. Horn Island sits off the Mississippi Gulf Coast. On the 4th of July, the area could attract boats, groups of friends, and people spending the holiday near the water. According to Nolan's mother, the trip itself was not unusual. Nolan was with a group of friends. The boys had reportedly stayed together the night before. Then, on the morning of July 4th, they headed out by boat. Christine has said the same group had made this type of trip before without a problem. That history matters. From the family's perspective, Nolan wasn't going somewhere unfamiliar with complete strangers. He was leaving with people he knew. Christine said Nolan did not give her an exact time he planned to return. She wasn't particularly concerned by that. He was 18. There had been other occasions when Nolan stayed out later than expected. Maybe he was with friends. Maybe he was watching a movie. Nothing about the lack of an exact return time immediately suggested something was wrong. Elmore later described the trip as something close to Nolan's last chance to relax before returning to the pressure of football and academics. A last hurrah, a brief break. Then Nolan would get back to work. The available public accounts indicate Nolan arrived at Horn Island with his friends. At some point during the afternoon, however, the situation changed. Nolan reportedly began speaking with a young woman. According to the explanation later relayed to the family, Nolan decided he wanted to remain on the island. His friends would leave, Nolan would stay, and he would reportedly find another ride back later. On the surface, it could sound like a spontaneous decision made by an 18-year-old during a holiday trip. But this is exactly where the accounts begin to divide. According to attorney Ben Crump, the young woman Nolan was reportedly speaking with has said Nolan indicated he was going back to the boat with the boys. But the friend's account, as publicly discussed, is different. They reportedly said Nolan wanted to stay behind with her. Those are two fundamentally different versions of Nolan's intention. In one, Nolan plans to leave Horn Island with his friends. In the other, Nolan deliberately remains behind. Crump summarized the problem with a simple question. Which is it? And that question matters because Nolan's decision at that moment is central to the entire timeline. If Nolan voluntarily stayed, what happened after his friends left? If Nolan intended to return to the boat, why did the boat leave without him? And regardless of which version is correct, how did Nolan's phone leave the island while Nolan apparently remained there? The family's questions don't begin with a theory of murder. They begin with the timeline. And the timeline begins to become more complicated when Nolan's phone enters the picture. A video circulated online after Nolan disappeared. The footage reportedly captures some type of argument on or around the island. Ben Crump has publicly discussed the audio. At one point, Crump described a voice he believed was Nolan's apparently demanding to know where his phone was and questioning what someone was doing. However, there is an important point of caution. When pressed in one interview about whether the voice had been definitively confirmed as Nolan, Crump appeared less certain. He referred to young people talking and an apparent argument. In another discussion, Crump spoke with greater confidence and described the audio as having been confirmed as Nolan. Those differences in how the audio has been described should be acknowledged. At this stage, the public should be careful about presenting an online video as definitive proof of what happened. But the underlying issue remains. There appears to have been some type of argument, and according to the family's attorney, that argument may have involved Nolan's phone. Then Nolan disappeared, and his phone was not with him. That is one of the biggest questions in this case. If Nolan deliberately chose to stay behind, why would he remain on a remote barrier island without the device he regularly used to communicate. How was he supposed to arrange a ride? How would he contact his parents if his plans changed? How would he reach emergency services if something happened? How would anyone locate him? Elmore has repeatedly returned to this point. In his view, even if Nolan had insisted on staying, his friends should have made sure he had his belongings. His phone, his bag, anything he needed. Elmore put the situation in simple terms. There were 3 of them, and 1 of Nolan. If Nolan refused to get on the boat, Elmore believes his friends should have pushed harder. Maybe they argue. Maybe they physically tussle. Maybe Nolan becomes angry. But, according to his father, you get him back to the mainland. Then you deal with the argument. Tomorrow, perhaps everybody is friends again. Elmore's point is about responsibility. He has said that if someone else's child were with him, he would not leave that child on an island. Christine made almost the same argument. If Nolan refused to get on the boat, she said she would have handed him a phone and called his parents. Let Nolan's mother or father tell him to get back on the boat. But at no point, Christine said, would she leave someone else's child behind, especially on an island. When she was directly asked whether she believed Nolan had been left behind, Christine answered yes. She said she does not believe her son decided to stay on the island alone. In her words, it wasn't his character. Elmore was equally direct. He does not believe Nolan volunteered to stay. He says he simply cannot believe it. Again, the parents' belief is not proof of what happened. Families can misunderstand their children. Young adults can make decisions their parents never expected. But in an active death investigation, the family's description of Nolan's habits and character is still relevant context, especially when the available accounts of his final intention appear to conflict. And then, hours later, Christine received a phone call, the call that changed the entire night. Christine wasn't immediately worried when Nolan failed to come home early that evening. Then, at 11:07 p.m., her phone rang. The caller was Warren, one of the young men who had been on the boat. Christine has said that the moment she saw one of Nolan's friends calling her directly, her heart dropped. Nolan's friends did not normally call her. Something was wrong. According to the accounts discussed in the family's interviews, Christine was told Nolan had remained behind on Horn Island. The explanation was that he wanted to spend time with a young woman reportedly named Katie. But Christine says another detail was mentioned during that initial conversation. She was reportedly told Katie was also missing, and that the group didn't really know who she was. For Christine, that created immediate confusion. The explanation for Nolan remaining on the island centered on a young woman. But according to Christine's recollection, that same young woman was initially described as unaccounted for and unknown to the group. Later, the accounts became even more complicated. Crump says the young woman reported that Nolan told her he was returning to his friends. The friends reportedly said Nolan told them he was staying with her. One final conversation, 2 different versions. Meanwhile, Christine was trying to determine where her son was. She contacted her friend Toshima, whose sons had known Nolan for years. The young men began looking at Snapchat location information. Christine checked Life 360, and the digital information raised another problem. Nolan's phone appeared to be in one location. His car was somewhere else, and Nolan himself was missing. Toshima reportedly offered to retrieve Nolan's phone. At the same time, Christine and Elmore began trying to involve law enforcement. What followed, according to Christine, was a confusing series of calls between agencies. The Sheriff's Department, Ocean Springs Police, the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources. Christine said she gave information, only to be redirected again. Eventually, Jackson County took control of the case. For the family, those early hours are now another source of frustration. A missing person investigation often depends heavily on the first hours. Locations can change. Witness memories can become less precise. Digital evidence can disappear. Physical evidence can be lost. The family believes precious time was spent simply trying to determine which agency had jurisdiction. It is important not to claim that this delay caused Nolan's death or destroyed specific evidence. There is no public proof of that. But the question of evidence preservation would later be raised by legal analysts reviewing the case. Because while Nolan remained missing, his phone was moving through other hands, and by the time it reached his mother, she says something was wrong. For Christine, Nolan's phone wasn't just another piece of property. It was a record of his normal behavior. She knew how often her son used Snapchat. She knew he took pictures. She knew he recorded moments. She knew he communicated. So when Christine and her sister finally looked through the phone, they expected to find some trace of Nolan's 4th of July. According to Christine, they found almost nothing. No saved videos from the event. No collection of pictures. Nothing that matched what she expected from her son's normal Snapchat activity. Her sister reportedly checked a secondary account. Again, Christine says there was nothing. The timing made the situation even more concerning to her. Christine said they began looking through Nolan's phone before 24 hours had passed. She believed relevant Snapchat content should still have been available within that window, but the content she expected wasn't there. Ben Crump has said the family believes Snapchat messages and standard text messages may have been deleted before the phone was returned. That is an allegation and concern raised by the family and their attorney. It is not at this stage public proof that a specific person intentionally deleted evidence connected to Nolan's death. That distinction matters. But it also explains why the family wants the phone examined forensically. Deleting a message from the visible screen of a phone does not always mean the underlying data is permanently unrecoverable. Digital forensic specialists may be able to recover information from a device, connected accounts, backups, or service providers depending on the circumstances. The family has said experts are working to recover information. For investigators, that data could be critical. Who was Nolan communicating with on July 4th? What time were messages sent? Were messages deleted? If so, when? Was the phone being actively used after Nolan was last seen? Where did the device travel? Did Nolan communicate that he planned to stay, or did he indicate that he intended to leave? The phone could potentially provide context that human memory cannot, and that is why its chain of custody has become such a major point of discussion. According to the family's timeline, Nolan's mother received the call at 11:07 p.m., but the phone itself did not immediately reach her. There was a delay. Legal analysts discussing the case have questioned what happened during that gap. Who had possession of the phone? Was it examined by law enforcement before being handled by others? Was a forensic preservation process immediately started? Were the people who possessed it asked detailed questions? Again, asking these questions does not establish criminal behavior. But in a case where the missing person's phone is separate from the missing person, the device becomes an obvious source of evidence. And for Nolan's parents, the phone creates a direct conflict with the story they were told. They are being asked to believe their son voluntarily stayed behind, yet the device he used constantly left without him. And when it came back, Christine says the digital activity she expected to find was gone. This is why she keeps asking the same question. Where is it? Where are the pictures? Where are the videos? Where are the conversations? For the Wells family, the missing content is not a minor technical detail. It is one of the reasons they say the story doesn't add up. As the hours passed, Nolan's disappearance became a search operation. Horn Island and the surrounding waters presented a difficult environment. The search involved authorities and outside volunteers. Among those discussing the conditions was Brian Trasher of the United Cajun Navy. A strong rip current in the area was raised as a real possibility. This point is important because Nolan's athletic ability has become part of the public conversation. Nolan was a college athlete. He was reportedly in excellent physical condition. He was also described as a good swimmer. Ben Crump has questioned how a young athlete could have entered distress around a beach with boats and people nearby, without anyone apparently seeing him or helping him. It is a powerful question, but it must be handled carefully. Strong swimmers can drown. Athletic fitness does not make someone immune to dangerous water conditions. Rip currents can overwhelm experienced swimmers. Heat, exhaustion, panic, alcohol, or other unknown factors can also affect a person's ability to survive in water. At the time reflected in these interviews, full toxicology findings and an official final cause of death had not been publicly confirmed. So Nolan's physical fitness cannot be used as proof that he did not drown. But Crump's broader question remains focused on witnesses. This was the 4th of July. People were reportedly on the island. Boats were nearby. If Nolan entered the water and began struggling, did anyone see him? Did anyone hear him? Did anyone notice a young man in distress? Investigators have asked the public to provide photographs and videos from the island. That request is significant. On a major holiday, dozens of unrelated people may accidentally record information important to an investigation. A person in the background of a photograph, a boat leaving, a group standing in a particular location, the clothing someone was wearing, a timestamp. Even a short video recorded for social media can help investigators reconstruct movement minute by minute. And in Nolan's case, one photograph reportedly did raise another question. A question about something as simple as the color of his shorts. After Nolan disappeared, Christine publicly asked people who had been on Horn Island to come forward with information. A young woman contacted her. According to Christine, this woman had been on the island on July 4th and had photographs from that day. The official description reportedly identified Nolan as wearing black shorts. But the woman told Christine the photographs showed something different, blue shorts. Christine says the woman sent the pictures directly to her. The photographs appeared to show Nolan on the island wearing blue shorts. On its own, the difference between black and blue shorts does not explain Nolan's death. It doesn't prove foul play. It doesn't identify a suspect. But that isn't why the detail matters to the family. It matters because it is a basic, verifiable piece of information. What was Nolan wearing? If a photograph from that afternoon shows blue shorts, why did an official description say black? Was it a simple mistake? Did someone provide incorrect information? Was the description based on memory rather than photographic evidence? And if an easily checked detail was wrong, what other early information needs to be verified? This is the pattern driving the family's concern. Not one dramatic piece of evidence. A series of smaller questions. Did Nolan say he was staying or leaving? Why was his phone separated from him? What happened to the content on the phone? Who had the device before Christine received it? Why did the clothing description reportedly conflict with a photograph? Why was there confusion over which agency would take the case? Why did investigators publicly discuss an absence of foul play while the cause of death was still being investigated? Any one of those questions might have an innocent explanation. But Nolan's parents are asking investigators to examine them together, and by the time Nolan was found, the family's questions were no longer about where their son was. They were about how he died. Days after Nolan disappeared, his body was recovered from the water near the same general stretch of beach where he had last been seen. The search was over, but the investigation was not. The state medical examiner conducted an autopsy. Investigators told reporters they suspected Nolan may have drowned. However, at the stage reflected in the family's interviews, a full official cause of death had not been finalized. Toxicology results were still part of the process. The family also pursued an independent autopsy in Washington, D.C. Former NFL quarterback and civil rights activist Colin Kaepernick helped fund the independent examination. Tyler Perry reportedly offered support by covering funeral expenses. Reverend Al Sharpton publicly joined the family's call for answers. And attorney Ben Crump became one of the most visible voices questioning the investigation. The involvement of high-profile figures brought national attention. It also intensified public speculation. Some online users immediately began constructing theories. Some focused on Nolan's friends. Others focused on race. Nolan was black. Several of the friends he traveled with were white. Christine directly addressed the racial discussion. She said she and her husband did not raise their children to reject friendships because of skin color. According to Christine, Nolan had a heart big enough to be a friend to everyone. She pointed to the support the family received, including support from Nolan's friends, as evidence of the kind of person her son was. Her focus was not on arguing about why Nolan had white friends. Her focus was what happened to him. Ben Crump, however, has discussed Mississippi's racial history when explaining why the family wanted an independent investigation. He referenced the killing of Emmett Till and raised concerns about ensuring that the death of a young black man receives a complete and transparent investigation. That historical comparison does not establish that Nolan was the victim of a racially motivated crime, and there is currently no public finding establishing that. But it explains the level of distrust surrounding the case and why the family sought independent review. The family's position remains consistent. They do not know exactly what happened, but they are not satisfied with the explanation they were initially given, and they are particularly concerned about how quickly authorities publicly stated that there was no evidence of foul play. Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter has publicly said investigators have found no evidence of a crime. But for Nolan's family, that statement came with an obvious question. How can foul play appear to be ruled out when so many questions remain? The conflicting accounts of Nolan's final conversation, the phone, the content his family believes was deleted, the argument captured on video, the clothing discrepancy, and the still unclear timeline of Nolan's final hours. Ben Crump argues these contradictions deserve closer examination before any possibility is dismissed. Now, no evidence of foul play does not mean investigators have proven Nolan's death was accidental. It simply means authorities have not found evidence of criminal involvement at this stage. Sheriff Ledbetter has also acknowledged that the public wants answers faster than investigators can provide them. And real investigations take time. Toxicology, phone analysis, witness interviews, digital evidence. But Nolan's family says that uncertainty is exactly the point. They want every possibility examined. Crump has even raised the possibility of the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation taking over the case, calling for an independent and transparent review. If Nolan drowned in a tragic accident, his family wants the evidence to show it. If negligence played a role, they want it investigated. And if a crime occurred, they want it pursued. They aren't asking for a predetermined conclusion. They want the truth. But for Nolan's father, Elmore, one part of the story remains almost impossible to accept. When Elmore speaks about Nolan, he repeatedly returns to action. He said words are not enough. You can tell someone you love them 1,000 times, but show them. To Elmore, friendship carries responsibility. If Nolan trusted the people he was with, Elmore believes that trust should have been returned by making sure Nolan got safely back on the boat. His argument is emotional, but it is also direct. If Nolan was making a bad decision, stop him. If he refused, call his parents. If he became angry, deal with the anger later. Elmore has said there were multiple people and only one Nolan. In his mind, his son's friends had options, and he cannot understand why the final outcome was Nolan remaining on Horn Island while the boat left. Christine has said the same thing in a different way. If she were responsible for someone else's child, she would not leave that person behind. Not on an island, not without contacting the parents. For Nolan's parents, the phrase, "he chose to stay," does not end the conversation. It begins it. Who heard Nolan make that decision? What exactly did he say? When did he say it? Did everyone hear the same thing? Why does the young woman's account reportedly differ from the friend's account? Was Nolan angry when the boat left? Was the argument over the phone connected to his decision? Why was the phone on the boat or mainland instead of with Nolan? Did Nolan have another confirmed ride? Who was that ride supposed to be? Did anyone see Nolan make arrangements with another group? When was Nolan last physically seen? And what happened after that moment? These are not accusations. They are timeline questions. And in a death investigation, timeline questions matter. Nolan's parents say the story they were given requires them to accept several things at once. That Nolan ignored years of advice and separated from his group. That he did so to remain with a young woman he had reportedly just met. That he remained without his phone. That he apparently did not contact his parents. That he somehow ended up in the water. And that despite the number of people reportedly around the area, no clear public witness account has emerged describing his final moments. Maybe investigators will eventually produce evidence explaining every one of those points. That is possible. But at the time of the family's interviews, Christine and Elmore say they had not received that explanation. That is why they keep speaking publicly. Another issue raised by Ben Crump involves access to Nolan's friends. Crump has said he has not personally spoken with the young men who were with Nolan because they retained legal representation. Hiring an attorney is not evidence of guilt. People connected to high-profile investigations often obtain legal counsel to protect their rights and manage communication. That fact should not be treated as proof that anyone committed a crime, but it does create a practical barrier for the family's legal team. The people physically present during Nolan's final known hours are not directly speaking with Crump. As a result, the family's attorneys are working from public statements, information shared through investigators and other accounts. One of the public statements discussed in connection with the case came from Judge Ashley Cole, whose son Warren was reportedly one of the friends on the boat. She publicly defended her son and offered her family's version of the timeline. Legal analysts later debated the timing and framing of that statement, One analyst suggested the statement appeared designed to establish a public record early, but that interpretation remains an analyst's opinion. It does not prove wrongdoing by Judge Cole or her son. What it does show is how divided the public narrative has become. There is the account attributed to the friends. There is the account attributed to the young woman Nolan was speaking with. There are Nolan's parents, who say the behavior described does not match their son. There are investigators saying they have found no evidence of a crime. And there is the family's attorney arguing that major contradictions remain unresolved. Somewhere inside those accounts is the actual sequence of events. The task of investigators is to separate memory, assumption, and public speculation from evidence. Phone records, location data, photographs, videos, boat movements, witness interviews, forensic findings, autopsy results, toxicology. Those are the pieces that may eventually establish what happened. And one of the most important pieces may still be hidden inside Nolan's phone. The family's concern about Nolan's phone has become central because digital evidence can create a timeline with remarkable precision. A text message has a time. An application login can have a time. Location data can create movement patterns. Photographs may contain metadata. Cloud accounts may preserve information that no longer appears on the physical device. The exact availability of this information depends on the phone, application settings, account configuration, and legal access investigators obtain. But legal analysts discussing Nolan's case have emphasized that deleted does not always mean permanently gone. One analyst referenced previous experience in a murder case where deleted messages were recovered and became important evidence. For Nolan's family, that possibility creates hope. Not necessarily hope that the phone will reveal a crime, hope that it will reveal a timeline. Christine wants to know what was on her son's device. She knows Nolan's habits. That is why an apparently empty Snapchat history from the trip immediately concerned her. If Nolan spent July 4th taking pictures and communicating as he normally did, where is that activity? If the data was automatically deleted, can that be established? If someone manually deleted content, can investigators determine when? Was the phone unlocked? Who knew Nolan's passcode? Who physically possessed the device after leaving the island? Was Nolan's phone used while Nolan was missing? These questions may have technical answers, and those answers matter because memories can conflict. Digital timestamps do not remember an event differently because someone is scared, confused, or under pressure. Data has its own limitations, but properly collected digital evidence can test witness statements. If Nolan told someone he planned to stay, perhaps a message supports that. If he planned to leave, perhaps his communication reflects that instead. If he was trying to recover his phone, perhaps there are messages or activity immediately before the device separated from him. For the Wells family, recovering the data could be one of the clearest ways to move beyond competing stories. Because right now, they say there are too many versions, and their son is no longer alive to give his. For Christine and Elmore, this case is not an internet mystery. It is their son. While strangers debate theories and analyze videos, they are living with a permanent absence. Elmore spent years preparing Nolan for adulthood. Stay focused, stay with your group, think ahead, get back to business. Nolan had football ahead of him, school, a possible tryout, a future his parents believed he was actively working toward. Then came July 4th, a boat trip, a decision his parents say they don't recognize, a phone that left the island without him, conflicting accounts about what Nolan said, an apparent argument, digital content his mother expected to find but says was missing, a search, and finally, the recovery of Nolan's body. His parents are now being asked to live with an explanation they say they cannot make sense of. Maybe the final autopsy findings will answer some questions. Maybe forensic examination of the phone will establish exactly what happened to the missing content. Maybe photographs and videos from Horn Island will help investigators reconstruct Nolan's final movements. Maybe witnesses will provide details the public has not yet heard. But until the timeline is clear, Christine and Elmore say they will keep asking questions. Because to Nolan's father, the story begins with something he knows he taught his son repeatedly. If you leave with the group, you come back with the group. And to Nolan's mother, there is one decision she says she cannot imagine making herself. leaving someone else's child behind on an island. The official investigation has not established that Nolan was murdered. No one has been charged with causing his death, and suspicion should never be presented as guilt. But an absence of criminal charges does not erase the questions Nolan's family is asking. Why did the accounts of Nolan's final conversation conflict? Why was his phone separated from him? What happened to the content Christine expected to find? What exactly happened after Nolan's friends left? And how did an 18-year-old college athlete, surrounded by people on a 4th of July trip, end up dead in the water? Christine and Elmore say they don't have the answer. That is the point. They want one. Not a theory from social media, not speculation, not a rushed conclusion. An answer supported by evidence. Because somewhere between the moment Nolan arrived on Horn Island and the moment his body was recovered, something happened, and Nolan can no longer explain it himself. Now his parents are demanding that every phone record, every photograph, every video, every witness account, and every minute of that timeline be examined until the story finally makes sense. If you've been following the Nolan Wells case, tell us what part of the timeline raises the biggest question for you. And remember, asking questions is not the same as accusing someone of a crime. At Midnight Crime Files, we follow the evidence, separate documented facts from allegations, and keep the victims at the center of the case. Subscribe to Midnight Crime Files and turn on notifications, because as new findings emerge in the investigation into Nolan Wells's death, we'll continue following the case. For Christine and Elmore, this is not over. Their son left for Horn Island with a group. He never came home, and until someone can explain exactly why, his parents say the same thing. The story doesn't add up.